So now it's time for part 5 of my ownership lecture. In part 4, I told you that there is a difference between different owners. And one way to conceptualize the difference between different owners is to use the concept of governance strategy, emphasizing that owners differ in competence, in how they gain, what kind of information they have, the cost of their governance, and their specific interest. Now we will go into the specific owners that we can identify to exist in capitalistic societies, and maybe especially Swedish. I have now three sections. I start with this section that contains funds, corporations, government, and entrepreneurs as specific owners. And then I have specific one section is about families, and the last section is about the very characteristic of many continental and Scandinavian ownership structures, and that is the business group. So let's start with owner categories with this overall. I have chosen to have only some of these categories. Maybe you can find more categories and you can find subcategories of all these categories, but there are different owner categories. And the first one that we will focus on is funds, the foreign domestic pension investment funds. Then there are corporations, when corporations as such are active as owners. Then there is the government, of course. In certain countries, the government is very significant as owner, in others, not so much. Then we have the entrepreneurs, the single owner. And then we come to the special section of families and a special section of business groups. And then we could consider to maybe in the future, I will add a specific section about foundations. But we have foundations in the course literature that you can read about. But here we start with those that I've listed. It's really hard to decide how do you describe owners. You need categories in order to describe. And of course, governance strategy is one way to try to grasp what is an owner. How do you describe the owner? I try to do it through using these categories that I show here on the slide. First, I try to think if the kind of investment they have done in competence and information about the firm, do they have a high level of information and competence for the specific firm in which they are investing, or do they have low? The competence, is it firm specific, the competence, or is it very general? The transferability is the idea, do they have shares in order to be able to transfer the shares, or are they stuck in this investment? The investment they do in network, do these owners have a huge network or a very specific or small network? Part of this investment in network is the access to business elites. I think that could be very important, because especially to have access to the business elite of a society makes it possible for you to recruit the directors to your board more easily. Investment, of course, how much have you done investment in capital? Is it a huge investment or a low investment? The diversification capacity is the capacity of an owner to diversify its investment into many different corporations, or they are just investing in one corporation. Risk preference, it's between high and low. Could we assume that they have a preference to assume high level of risk or low level of risk? Then there is the liquidity preference. Do they need money? For example, an owner that has lended a lot of money in order to have this ownership. This lending means that they have to pay interest. This interest means that they need liquidity. So that is the liquidity preference. And then the ownership of the votes. Have they invested so they have a lot of votes or less votes? And that is possible to do in Sweden because we have this difference in the profit rights and voting rights, that it's 1 to 10. So you can have a share that have 1/10 of a voting right that another share, but they have the same profit rights. So then all this can sum up, I think, to the idea of a governance strategy. If it's a strategy that's very active, that the owner is very present in the corporation, try to influence it, much like the Adam Smith idea of an owner that is working in the corporation, or the passive, far away from the corporation, sitting, zipping the tea at the stock market in London while operations are made out in the world. So these are the characteristics I use in order to describe. Of course, other researchers choose other characteristics. And if you would like to contribute to our understanding of corporate governance, I urge you, try to create a theory of an owner that summarize these characteristics into specific categories. Now, we start with a financial fund. A financial fund is, for example, a pension fund. Those that are especially active on the stock market, they are trading shares. They are not really like speculators, but they are not really like the industrialists that really knows about the corporation, or maybe in between. They are not day traders probably, but they could be very quick in their entering and exiting an investment. Typically, these financial funds have employees that have a lot of financial competence. They could have industrial competence. For example, if you have a fund that is specializing in drug development, in medicine, then you could expect them to have a financial analyst that knows a lot about how to develop drugs. But mainly it's a financial competence, and that restricts, of course, their competence. They gain their financial supply mainly from investors. They get continuous supply from those that would like to have a good pension in the future. They supply this financial fund with money, or if it's other kind of fund. Typically, they are evaluated not through other means than through index comparison, because they create portfolios, and the profit of this portfolio, that is compared to an index, and then they can find out if they are good or bad. They compete with other funds that are similar, that also are selling the possibility to get a beautiful life when you are a pensioner. So that's the competition they have. One could say that they probably are specialized in capital allocation. They are not specialized in developing corporations. They are specialized in capital allocation. And they represent now what's been termed fund activism. That is when funds are active, they're trying to influence, for example, the election of directors to the board. And maybe in some cases they're trying to influence the corporation. Very seldom you find these as the representatives of at the board of directors, because if you are at the board of directors, that means that you have made an investment really as an owner in a corporation, and you are not expected to be there 2 months and then you sell your investment, then you jump off the board of directors. So funds, to summarize it in my way of categorizing, the investment in competence and information about the firm is quite moderate. It's not low, but it's not high. The competence is rather general, and if it's specific, it's probably financial oriented. Transferability, it's very high. They would like to sell them shares because they earn their profit through the increase of the shares and to realize it through selling. Investment in network and the business elite is probably rather low, because they don't gain so much capacity through this kind of investment. They need investment in order to understand how the share market is developing. The investment in capital is low, as is the ownership in votes. because if you have a huge investment, it's really hard to leave the investment. It's easier to leave an investment that is not so big. And since they have a high preference on transferability, they don't invest so much, maybe maximum 5%. I mean, that is not, in big corporation, the investment as such is not big, but the investment in that corporation is not so big. Risk preference, well, it's hard to say. Maybe it's an indifference here, but certain funds have a very high risk profile, others have a low profile. All in all, when we summarize it, you could expect financial funds to have a governance strategy that is quite passive. Passive in the means that they are not entering and trying to influence the strategy and structure of the corporation. They're quite passive. If they influence maybe through suggesting people to the board of directors, but mainly they influence through buying and selling the shares. On the other side, if we have corporations, if there is a corporation, maybe a listed corporation that has shares in another corporation, that also, like the fund, is an organization that have the ownership and then the organizational characteristics. They have employees that have operational and financial competence. It's hard to really know which competence they are using when they are buying shares in another corporation. Probably not much of the financial competence, but of the operational. Because I believe that corporations, if they have ownership in another corporation, it is because these corporations support the strategy of the other corporation. So it could be very operational that you get gains through operational synergies. They get the financial supply from their own operations. They are evaluated as owners from the market and from other owners of this corporation. I assume that they're specialized in operations because they have shares in another corporation because it fits to their organization, to their operations in this organization. So they have a strategy interest, maybe a forward or backwards integration. That is my expectations of corporations as owners. That means when we look at my table of categories, that the investment they are doing is quite high because they have a competence and information about the firm because they want synergies in the ownership. The competence is very firm specific. They don't invest in whatever corporation, but in the corporation that can support the strategy of the corporation. The level of transferability I put here moderate, maybe it's low. It couldn't be high because if you would like to have synergies between two corporations, it doesn't come if you buy and then sell this immediately. The network investment is maybe low in general, but maybe it's high in the business elite, in those that are working in this kind of industry. The capital, I expect to be very high, this capital investment, because they would like to have control. They would like to make sure that this corporation where they invest keeps with their strategy, because that is the idea with the synergy effects. So they invest high in capital, and as you see below, there is the ownership votes is also high because you would like to have control of the strategy. The diversification capacity is very low because they need this corporation in order to support their own corporation. Risk preference, well, I don't think there is any risk preference because they need a synergy, whatever. Liquidity preference, they don't have. They are not investing in another corporation in order to get the dividend from the corporation. So all in all, the governance strategy, I would expect to be quite active in the corporation. Next owner is the government. A government is, yes, an organization, a very specific kind of organization, because the government is fueled by politics. So when they have an investment, they have a political interest in the corporation. So efficiency for them is really not the profit of a corporation. It is something that has to do with the political reasons why they invest. Sometimes government invest in cooperation because they see that the market is not functioning very well. So in a way to make the market function better, they invest in a cooperation. The financing, well, it's a piece of a cake, you would say, because it's the taxpayer, the endless resources of taxpayer that supply the finance of government. So it's really hard to know. I'm not acquainted to many studies of the government as an owner. The investment competence and information about the firm maybe is low because they want the firm only to perform kind of strategy for the government. Competent, I don't know really. Transferability, it should be rather low because they invest in a corporation in order to control the market, for example. The network investments are low. The access to business elite is, as I can assume, is low because they are not. Politicians are among politicians, not with the business elite. The investment that they do in the capital could be moderate, and also in the voting shares because they don't want to invest too much, but that they need to invest into the extent that they can make sure that the corporation will exist in the way they want it to exist. Diversification capacity is extremely high. They can enter into what kind of investment they would like to. Risk preferences, I would assume that they don't have any risk preferences. They don't care about the risk because they are focusing on the corporation. Liquidity preference, since they are financed by the taxpayer, they don't have a high level of liquidity preference. So all in all, the governance strategy could be expected to be rather passive. If the corporation is doing what they should do, then they don't interfere in the activities. And finally, to the entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is an individual. It's not an organization. It's an entrepreneur. It's an individual. It's a single person that has that creates a corporation and then maybe can sustain the ownership. That's not so very common. Entrepreneurs they are not so common as owners. They're individuals. It's often a startup or turnover when they have turnover or corporation. And one would say that if there is something, capacity of these entrepreneurs is that they typically have charisma. They are quite identifiable as individuals. When we look at how entrepreneurs are acting, they have the competence and information they have about the firm is extremely high because they are totally focused on this corporation. The competence is highly firm specific. They are specialists in their firm and in their firm's market. Transferability, well, that should be a little bit moderate because, or maybe even low, because an entrepreneur is identified as part of this firm. So you don't sell your identity. Access to business elite is probably moderate because entrepreneurs can sometimes be considered to be a little bit awkward persons. But in investment, they have an investment in a network that supports them and their corporation. That could be expected to be high. The investment in capital as well as in ownership votes is very high because they control the corporation. They really control the corporation. So they need a lot of money in order to invest. That's why entrepreneurs tend to disappear when the corporation is growing, because then you need higher level of equity, and then a single person cannot really collect all this capital, especially not if you would like to enter as an owner. Diversification capacity is very low, and they don't have an interest in diversification because they are focused on one single corporation. The risk preference, they can assume high risk because that's they are focused on one product or one corporation. Liquidity preference could be expected to be rather high because in order to keep the ownership, maybe you need to lend money in order to be able to supply the corporation with equity. So therefore you lend a lot of money, and you need a lot of money in order to pay the interest. Overall then, the governance strategy would be expected to be extremely high, so high that it looks like the Adam Smith capitalists that are engaged, walking around in the firm, engaged in whatever activities they are doing in the firm. So that was the beginning of these different categories of owners. These are just a collection. We will focus much more on families and business groups, which we now will